was then that things ground to a halt yet again, and the process looked in danger of stalling completely, with Phnom Penh, actually supported by Hanoi, expressing a whole series of reservations about the Permanent 5 negotiating text. I won't go into the detail. But then, in the middle of 1991, just as all seemed to be just about completely lost, there was some extraordinary new life injected into the process, and this is where Prince Sihanouk emerged from months of, I think, self-imposed isolation, formed a rather improbable liaison with Hun Sen, which, being with the apparent approval of China, because Sihanouk had always been very close, of course, to China, then pushed the Khmer Rouge really into a corner. He convened a meeting of what had become known as the Supreme National Council, the formal grouping of the four factions. He convened a meeting in Pattaya in Thailand in late June, which is the first time that it actually met since it had been formally established some 9 months earlier. And at that meeting brokered a whole series of agreements between the Cambodian parties in which all of them did express their support for the framework as it had evolved from the Permanent 5 negotiations, and basically for a comprehensive settlement in which the UN would play a central role. So with that finally accomplished, and Sihanouk was really part of the solution at that stage, we did have the comprehensive political settlement being signed in Paris on 23rd of October 91 by all the international participants in the original Paris conference, plus the four Cambodian parties. And that settlement committed the parties and those supporting them to a permanent ceasefire, the holding of elections, the adoption of a new democratic constitution, and all under the supervision of the UN through this UN Transitional Authority, UNTAC. But of course, peacemaking is never over until it's over, and the crucial necessity now became for the Paris agreements to be effectively implemented. In February 92, the UN Security Council approved the overall plan for UNTAC, which called for nearly 16,000 military personnel, 3,500 civilian police, over 1,000 administrative personnel, with 34 countries contributing to the military operation, 45 to the peacekeeping exercise overall. And this was a pretty breathtaking commitment from the international community in terms of anything that had gone before with the UN operation, by far the biggest ever to have occurred. The first UNTAC units arrived in Cambodia a few weeks later in March 92, accompanied by the Secretary General's Special Representative, Yasushi Akashi from Japan, and also the Australian commander of the military component, Lieutenant General John Sanderson. And I have to say, without being too rude about our Japanese colleague, who's still alive and well and living in Tokyo and a good friend, I have to say that without the outstanding professional leadership on the military side of Sanderson, I don't think we would have survived the things that then proceeded to go wrong with the UNTAC operation. Because a lot of trouble did eventuate, and it wasn't long in coming. By June 1982, it became apparent that one of the really core elements in the settlement was just not going to be fully implemented as a result of the refusal of the Khmer Rouge to canton and to disarm their troops. You had breaches of the ceasefire also occurring, although on a relatively small scale. More troubling were some direct attacks on UNTAC civilian and military personnel. You had... Yes, please, if you wouldn't mind. You had a kind of a justification being articulated by the Khmer Rouge for their intransigence, in that they said, look, you can't expect us to be cooperative with all of this because Hun Sen's government, the state of Cambodia, is retaining control of the administrative structure despite the fact that the UN Civil Administration Brigade was supposed to be sitting on their shoulders and really giving weight and content to this idea of a central role, central role in the whole transitional process. The truth of the matter was that Hun Sen did have something to complain about in this respect. sorry, the Khmer Rouge had something to complain about in this respect, because it did take a hellishly long time for the UN civil administration component to be effectively deployed. And even when it was deployed, it never became the very confident monitoring and at least neutrality guaranteeing body that it had been intended to be. It was supposed to sit there in all the key parts of the government administration and ensure that there was no manipulation of budgets or support or military activity or whatever. It was supposed to do the whole lot, and it didn't do that very well. Khmer Rouge never did cooperate with UNTAC, never did show any willingness to participate in the UN-organised elections. But despite this, and despite the violence which did characterise the electoral campaign, and not all the violence came from the Khmer Rouge side, the general atmosphere, and this was a very fine judgment at the time, the general atmosphere was judged sufficiently neutral for the elections to proceed. And this happened, as some of you here may remember, in May 1993, with almost 90% turnout of the eligible electorate. And to everyone's surprise and delight, almost no violent disruptions on election day. And I have to say, I don't think in my entire life I've ever been more moved than when, sitting back in Australia, I saw those first satellite pictures of men, women, children lined up at the polling stations. And there's scores of thousands, and lined up knowing the risk of a bomb attack, but absolutely thrilled at the prospect of peace at last and the chance that this meant to have some say at last in how they lived their lives. The results of the election brought a further surprise and disruption. The clear winner was Sihanouk's Funcinpec, with Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party coming a rather poor second against all expectations, and certainly against Hun Sen's. And Hun Sen, in a foretaste, unhappily, of what was to come, absolutely refused to accept this, and after a lot of backwards and forwards, a very uneasy power-sharing arrangement was eventually adopted, with the new government headed by Sihanouk's son, Prince Ranrid, as, quote, first Prime Minister, and Hun Sen as second Prime Minister, with mainly Funcinpec and CPP co-ministers in each portfolio. So we have to acknowledge that by no means did everything go perfectly with the UNTAC operation. Obvious lessons to be learned were the fundamental need for greater flexibility within UN headquarters and in the field to get operations up and running quickly and to deal much more rapidly with significant changes in conditions on the ground. There were serious weaknesses as well, as I've already just said, in what was in many ways the most innovative single element of the whole peace plan, the idea of the administrative function, and certainly the thing that had stimulated my engagement in this and which I'd made the centrepiece of the original proposal, and this was rather weak in its actual implementation. It's also very clear in retrospect, I think one needs to say, and this is a bit of an extension of the same point, but put differently, it's clear that the Paris agreements should have included much more specific measures for building a functional criminal justice system as part of the transitional period and as part of the post-conflict peace-building exercise. The rule of law institutions needed to support that had clearly broken down in Cambodia. And if a peacekeeping force is given, as this one was, a mandate to guard against human rights violations, but there's no functioning system to bring violators to justice, even those who violated others' right to life, then not only is the UN force's mandate to that extent unachievable, but its whole operation is likely to have diminished credibility, both locally and internationally. And I think it was in Cambodia that we learnt that lesson the hard way. But despite all the setbacks and deficiencies, the UN-supervised settlement did achieve its principal aims. It succeeded in removing the Cambodian conflict as a source of acute, continuing regional tension. It enabled Vietnam to enter into much more productive relations, regionally and internationally. External patrons, not least China with the Khmer Rouge, did withdraw material support for the various political groupings, sucking away the oxygen that had sustained that civil war for so long. The more than 365,000 displaced Cambodians from the Thai border area were successfully repatriated. And that in itself was a gigantic achievement. The path was cleared for Cambodia to assume at last its rightful place in the community of nations. Reconstruction could at last begin. At the signing of the Paris peace agreements back in 1991, I said in the course of the speech I made there, quote, "Peace and freedom are not prizes which once gained can never be lost. They must be won again each day. Their foundations must be sunk deep into the bedrock of political stability, economic prosperity, and above all, the observance of human rights." Well, I think the truth of that observation has been amply demonstrated in the course of events since 1993, and you've been talking about this, I guess, for a lot of the day before I came. The democratic process has remained fragile, deeply fragile. The biggest shock coming with Hun Sen's coup in July 1997, but with plenty of other things to be legitimately concerned about, both before and since 1997, including the continued obstacles that have been put in the way of Sam Rainsy and his party operating as a full-throated opposition voice, and in the case, of course, of Sam Rainsy himself, even being able to be present in the country. It is unhappily no exaggeration to describe Cambodia today as a de facto one-party state. The legal system is still in very poor shape, with far too many still having a sense of impunity that they can do just about anything without the justice system touching them, and there's continuing troubling signs of politicisation of the courts. Not coincidentally, there's been a very long and tortuous process, as you'll know, involved in bringing to justice the main perpetrators of the 1970s genocide in this hybrid national-international tribunal set up for the purpose. I'm actually not as critical as some others of the decision by the government not to continue prosecutions beyond the present core surviving leadership group, including Khieu Samphan, with whom I have to say I had personally many negotiating sessions, a rather disconcerting experience when you stop to think of the magnitude of the slaughter for which he'd shared responsibility. But for a whole variety of reasons, I think it's a defensible position to say let's do a proper job on these three but draw the line there, if that in fact is what's going to happen. But that said, I think it's hard not to be deeply unimpressed by the political gamesmanship and the lack of evidently sincere commitment to this whole process over many years by Hun Sen and those around him. When we set in train the UN peace plan for Cambodia in 1989, it really was with a three-part agenda, the hope being to deliver not just peace, but democracy and human rights as well. I actually suspected at the time, didn't say so all that publicly, but certainly said it privately, I suspected that we were being a little bit optimistic on the latter two objectives, democracy and human rights, and I'm afraid that's absolutely proved to be the case. That doesn't diminish the scale of the original achievement, which was to do that which was desperately needed, to return some semblance of normality after the years of most horrific violence to the country. And the peace process did deliver that. Despite all the attacks to which I was subject by people like the journalist John Pilger and other sceptics who blasted me very loudly at the time, claiming that the Australian-initiated process was playing into the hands of the Khmer Rouge, I think on that front our confidence that the process would lead to the eventual disintegration of the Khmer Rouge has been absolutely vindicated. And that element, that core rationale for the Australian plan, as I described it at the outset, giving a role to the UN which would give the Chinese a face-saving reason to withdraw from supporting the Khmer Rouge, that would result